Okay, let's get going again. My name is Elspeth Graham, for those of you who don't know me. And here we are today, on the edge of the water, but on the land, on a day when across the country thousands of school children and others are protesting about issues of climate change and something. So there's a certain appropriateness, a certain serendipity perhaps in what we're doing today. So we're here today and it's lovely. This time 2 weeks ago, I was actually in a different world, a world of turquoise and ultramarine luminosity, immersed in the body-warm, gently rippling waters of to Ioannio Pelagos, or the Ionian Sea. And as I moved, suspended in blue and the rhythm of swan strokes, I thought, as you do, of Francis Willoughby, the 17th century natural historian who, along with John Ray, published the Historia Piscium for the Royal Society in 1686. This is often considered the first systematic or scientific study of fish. And I remembered how Willoughby and Ray's motivation for producing this incredibly expensive book. It was so expensive that actually Isaac Newton's Principia had to be held back for a year because of it, and they already knew Newton's Principia was going to be important. But this expensive book didn't just come out of a recognizably scientific impulse. Rather, it came out of the author's perception of the watery realm as a mirror of heaven. As above, so in the deep. So the luminous blue of the Ionian and the Mediterranean seas is, I thought as I swam, as near to heaven as I'm ever likely to get. But as we know, the sea's notions aren't all celestial. And as I swam, I also had melancholic and alarming thoughts. The sea was, for hundreds of meters away from the shore, empty. Part of its beauty was its total emptiness, but it was also newly sterile. There are noticeably fewer fish in European seas than even 5 or 10 years ago. Overfishing, climate change, pollution, plastic have all had their effects. Our ways on living on our planet have visibly depopulated the blue realm. So I thought too of recent history's blue realm advocates. David Attenborough, of course, in the UK with his Blue Planet. I thought of the scientists who conducted the 10-year census of marine life from 2000 to 2010, and the statement by the project lead scientist, Paul Snellgrove, who wrote, "We are a species that breathes air rather than water, which biases our view of the watery planet Earth. We might better call a globe with 71% water cover and more than 99% of its living biosphere in marine waters, planet ocean." And I also thought of two magical, wise, and paradigm-changing books that I love. At the Bottom of Shakespeare's Ocean and Shipwreck Modernity, Ecologies of Globalization, 1550 to 1719. And these, of course, are just two of the large number of books, at least 4 monographs and 4 edited connections, and I think maybe more on the way, and many, many articles written by our plenary speaker for today, Professor Stephen Mentz from St. John's University, New York. And as those titles suggest, Steve is an early modernist, teaching and writing about Shakespeare and early modern literature, but also more broadly, he writes about environmental humanities, eco-critical theory, and eco-poetics. In fact, like the oceans themselves, Steve's work is unbounded by period, by constraining methodologies, or generic separations between the poetic and the analytic or scholarly. He's not confined just by the early modern either. He's, for instance, co-edited The Sea in the 19th Century, as well as another collection on Oceanic New York. And he's also curated important exhibitions such as Lost at Sea, The Ocean and the English Imagination, 1550 to 1750, at the Folger in 2010. And most of all, I think of this, Steve's writing, because it's always beautiful. He's actually one of those incredibly irritating writers who every sentence makes you think, I wish I'd written that. I wish I could write like that. But perhaps most importantly, Steve has been instrumental in the development of the blue or oceanic humanities. Phrases that we perhaps all recognise now, such as wet globalisation, blue ecology, and the book's title, Shipwreck Modernity, all come from Steve. This is important work, obviously, so I'm massively privileged, excited, and delighted to introduce Professor Steve Mentz to you. And he's going to talk to us now about acting human in the Anthropocene, a Shakespearean immersion.
Thank you so much. That's an incredibly generous and flattering introduction. Hopefully I'll figure out how to operate all these things so that I can move the slides forward. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here today. I'm particularly glad. It's my first visit to Liverpool. I'm told that it's always beautiful and sunny here, and so I'm glad that it lives up to the advanced press. It's been really just an extraordinary time to get to walk around and visit the city a little bit, and I look forward to seeing sculptures in the ocean and perhaps some other oceanic things during the rest of my visit. So let's just go ahead and get started. There we go. So that's a kind of rough outline of what I'll be talking about for the next 40 minutes or so. I'm going to be grappling with two significant problems. The biggest problem, which is climate change in a global sense, and then a related but arguably slightly smaller problem, although there's a perspective issue, which is the problem of being human. I will offer, once I get through those two problems, a Shakespearean lesson, and then I will proffer a concluding utopian vision. The lesson will be about acting, and it will come from everyone's favorite literary whiner, Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. But I hope that by the time we get to the Shakespearean part, we'll be ready to think about uber-canonical literary masters in a somewhat atypical or unexpected context. My Shakespeare tends to be a bit messy and also a bit wet. So today, as Elspeth just reminded us, is Friday the 20th of September 2019. And if I were back in New York today, I'd be joining the global climate strike spearheaded by Greta Thunberg. This is an image of Greta Thunberg that was done as a mural in Bristol, I think in the early part of this year. Greta is back in my local waters of New York City today as part of the global climate strike. Don't worry, I'm not going to go on strike right now in the middle of my own lecture, and I'm incredibly happy to be here for this inspiring event. But I want to think about the global climate strike, think about the example of Greta Thunberg, and the ways in which she is asking us to think about the role of the humanities in public life. I take that to be, in some sense, the sort of undersong of all the things we've been hearing about so far this morning, that what a research institute exists to do is to support the different kinds of things that we do in the humanities and the ways in which we can speak broadly to major questions of public and collective interest. So it's a commonplace, of course, although it's perfectly true, that it is Greta's generation that will reap the whirlwind of climate change. We who are gliding down the farther side of a half-century slope of years need to remember what we owe to her generation and to the future that they represent. I'm primarily a literary historian, and a blue humanist and all the other things we've already mentioned, but I do spend a lot of time thinking and teaching and writing about a pretty small period of English cultural history, the age of Shakespeare. But it's essential to what I believe is our core job as professors and researchers and teachers and writers, that we need to use the age of Shakespeare, or whatever our little place of research specialty is, to imagine possible futures. And really, it's possible futures that I'm ultimately talking about today, and I'm going to use a variety of different texts to try to get us toward a way to imagine a possible future. So when Greta says, "I want you to act as if the house is on fire," she is focusing her own anxiety and despair into political pressure. And I want to respond to that phrase also in a kind of broader sense of politics, perhaps. And really responding to despair is going to be a recurring topos in my talk today. It's what Greta's doing, it's what Hamlet does, and it's also, I think it's reasonable to say, a recurring undercurrent in the way we think about climate in the world today. Climate change makes us feel dark thoughts, and that's one reason why it's hard to address in kind of political and practical terms, and also in the relatively short windows of public attention, short temporal windows. Greta Thunberg's youthful insistence that we grown-ups need to act in the face of crisis has become a powerful mobilizing symbol in the face of increasingly dire climate news. And I'm going to start today by juxtaposing her determined and aggressive presence against a deeply pessimistic eco-essay written a little bit less than 2 weeks ago by the American novelist Jonathan Franzen in The New Yorker. The essay, What If We Stop Pretending the Climate Apocalypse is Coming, was e-published on the New Yorker's website at 6 a.m. East Coast time on Sunday morning, the 8th of September. By the end of that day, and this is the picture that the New Yorker chooses to use to sort of advertise the piece, children playing in the fire. By the end of that day, the 8th of September, Franzen's logic, his prose, and his apparent willingness to wash his hands of the whole thing had been excoriated and attacked multiple times on my admittedly unrepresentative Twitter feed. This is, does anybody like this guy? And Shut Up Franzen by two prominent New York-based academics and scientists. And then this spilled out into the popular press over the next week or so. And Franzen gets a lot of things wrong, and I'll talk about a couple of them in the next 10 minutes. He also never quite thinks outside of his own personal experience, which is maybe a more significant problem. His passivity makes an instructive contrast with Greta Thunberg's activism. But without giving too much attention to another sad old white guy, I do think the Greta versus Franzen smackdown can help clarify the ways that we, as thinkers, writers, professors, and citizens might respond to climate doomsaying in the present. How are we supposed to act, and what are we supposed to do? So I don't have technical answers, and I'm not really going to give a speech about politics today, though I think there are many straightforward political and technical things that we need to be doing right now. As I said before, I'm a literature professor, and I'm going to talk about the kinds of stories we need to tell about climate, the ways in which our reflexive allegiance to certain kinds of cherished narrative forms can inhibit our responses, and also some possible ways that literary texts, even our old friend Hamlet in his inky cloak, can help us respond. So now, problem number one, climate apocalypse. Franzen's essay touched a nerve for many people, including me, because he's an eloquent writer in the grip of despair. He's worried that it's too late and it's hard not to sympathize. The largest global activist network that's responding to climate change, Bill McKibben's 350.org, took its name in 2008 from what it then judged to be the maximum safe allowable parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, 350. Current measurements in 2019 has put us above 415 multiple times already. The number is obviously moving the wrong way. When Franzen writes, "I don't see human nature changing fundamentally anytime soon," he broadcasts a hard-headed, slightly macho kind of realism that really is a form of climate despair. One of the reasons I'm interested today in bringing together Greta, Franzen, and Hamlet is that they're all responding to the dark emotional landscape of the environmental present. Franzen's not wrong to be worried, though he seems overly convinced that he personally can evaluate all the available evidence. I can run 10,000 scenarios through my model, he writes, and in not one of them do I see the 2-degree target being met. These scenarios might be more convincing if were it not for his admission that what he calls his model is basically just his novelist's imagination. His bleak vision isn't scientific, but novelistic. He thinks being a humanist and being a pessimist amount to the same thing. Humans are going to be human. History, not to mention art and literature, shows that we tend to be violent, competitive, grasping, and short-sighted. Now, there is, thankfully, one key point in which Franzen gets his thinking just exactly wrong. It's simply not true, and a lot of the responses to Franzen's article have mentioned this. It's not true that if we don't hit the 2-degree target, we might as well give up. In the grips of myopic individualism, which is itself, of course, a deeply human flaw, I might even say in some ways it's one of the flaws that gets shown and advertised and worked through in the modern novel, Franzen gets this point exactly backwards. And this is what Franzen says. In the long run, it probably makes no difference how badly we overshoot 2 degrees. Once the point of no return is passed, the world will become self-transforming. Now, that's totally wrong. That is I think it's the most destructive thing he says in an article full of half-truths and evasions. But it's a really dangerous, I think, way to think about climate change, although I think it's also a common way to think about climate change. There is no time in which climate action makes no difference. Every 10th or 100th of a degree above or below the now sort of mythical 2-degree limit, or maybe it's a 1.5-degree limit, represents thousands upon thousands of cases of human and non-human displacement and suffering, either created or avoiding. It's tempting to assume that since Franzen gets this basic point wrong, he also misunderstands the case for optimism. But I'm not sure if that's quite right. My sense is that things are really pretty close to as bad as he sees them. But in giving in to an apocalyptic vision, Franzen makes a narrative error. We might call it an error of the imagination. The New York-based climate justice writer Mary Heglar calls this kind of pessimism the work of denialists and doomer dudes, which I think are just great sort of characterizations of a certain kind of response to climate, a certain kind of insistent, almost joyful climate pessimism. And Heglar very shrewdly has no time for it. And she's right about that. I do think it's still worth digging a bit deeper into why people like Franzen fall into the doomer trap. There's a narrative problem with climate apocalypse. It's the wrong story. Apocalypse is an ancient story. It's a story that humans love, but it's the wrong story to be telling today for reasons that I'm going to explain. The Greek-derived word apocalypse, like its Latin cognate term revelation, means to uncover or disclose something hidden. As in the biblical book of Revelation, the word has come to define a narrative genre in which the world is entirely destroyed, perhaps to be transformed into something radically new. It's a genre of forbidden knowledge, of uncovering, transformation, and revealing. It's also a narrative that insists we look away from the world as it actually is. It's a narrative genre that imposes the human experience of life bounded by death onto universal ecological history. It's both an ancient and very contemporary story. In some ways, apocalypse is the dominant genre of young adult fiction today. But it's also a story we need to change in the present, or at least supplement with other stories. The problem with apocalypse is that it makes the story about us and not about the world. The disjuncture in scale between individual human lives and the vast chronologies of ecological history undergird the painful temptation of giving into apocalyptic thinking like Franzen's. Apocalypse, however, is a problem that literary criticism can help solve. Frank Kermode, in his brilliant study, The Sense of an Ending, published in 1967 and then revised in 2000, helps us see what is at stake in the apocalyptic narrative. And this is Kermode. Men, like poets, rush into the midst in medias res when they are born. They also die in mediis rebus, in the middle of things, and to make sense of their spans, they need fictive concords with origins and endings, such as give meanings to lives and poems. The end of the story is a figure for their own deaths. Franzen, who not coincidentally, I think, turned 70 less than a month before publishing his eco-apocalypse essay in The New Yorker, is, like Hamlet, distracted by his own mortality. He reads the fate of the world as if it echoed the shape of his own life. Kermode's sobering wisdom requires that we distinguish between the midst in which humans live and die and the imaginary ends that we fictionalize in myth and literature. We crave apocalypse because we don't want to face individual mortality. Franzen, in fact, admits that his climate anxiety bubbles up through his own avoidance of death. He makes a joke out of it. Psychologically, he writes, this denial makes sense. Despite the outrageous fact that I'll soon be dead forever, I live in the present, not the future. Given a choice between an alarming abstraction, death, and the reassuring evidence of my senses, breakfast, my mind prefers to focus on the latter. Here, Franklin performs Hegler's denialism exactly. And it shocks me to see an American writing about climate willing to defend denial in public. I mean, he's talking about denial of death, but I think it's the same as denial of climate change in some ways, especially writing in the elite neoliberal pages of The New Yorker. The turn from death to breakfast enables apocalypse to serve as a kind of personal shield. The world is ending, my life will end. These two unthinkable endings may well be the same thing. Time for breakfast. Apocalyptic thinking has long occupied a prestigious place in Western culture. Kermode cites the Bible, Shakespeare, Blake, Wallace Stevens, and many, many other canonical figures. But as Franzen all but admits, at bottom, apocalypse helps us deny that the world will go on without us. But it will. Imperfectly, brokenly, very likely catastrophically, the world will go on. Greta Thunberg, I very much hope, will outlive me and Jonathan Franzen and almost all the people in this room. It's our moral and political imperative to imagine her future stretching forward without the bleak hand-waving of apocalypse wiping the slate clean. I don't absolutely despise where Franzen ends up, cultivating his organic garden in California. I do think it's important and incumbent on older, wealthy white men who live in rich countries like Franzen, or like me, or like many of us here today, to spread our resources beyond merely our local environments. It's easy to make fun of Franzen for praising the tasty strawberries and kale at his local social justice farm share in Santa Cruz. But there is a place, an important place, I think, for local activism, especially to the extent that it helps us undercut industrial agriculture. But the task of a climate humanist, whether a novelist like Franzen or a Shakespeare critic like me, should be to craft new ways to narrate the human in a dynamic and threatening environment. That's the project Franzen avoids, in part because I think he doesn't realize that the story of climate crisis can't have a once-and-for-all ending, unlike the story of an individual human life, and also unlike a novel. Instead, the individual futures of billions of individual humans on our warming planet require endless narratives of entanglement and rupture, continuity and change. It's hard to know what shapes these narratives should take. When I have a question about narrative forms, I almost always turn to Shakespeare, and I will turn to Shakespeare in a few minutes, but we have one more stop before we get there, and that's the problem of being human. It's possible, and I think Franzen gets at this a little bit, that being human is itself the problem. Franzen jokes about being a humanist and therefore a pessimist, and maybe he's got a point. Maybe we need to get away from the usual ways of thinking about what it is to be human. Maybe reimagining and perhaps expanding our idea of the human can help us make sense of and respond to environmental catastrophe in the present, make way for the post-human futures. The question of the human and even of capital M man has risen to prominence in the eco-humanities since the Nobel Prize-winning chemist Paul Krugman coined the term Anthropocene to describe today's age of man-made climate change. But just who is the anthropos in whose scene we are supposedly living? What does it mean to be human in the age of man-made climate change? The rapidly growing discourse of the Anthropocene humanities challenges readers and thinkers to engage with a field in kind of constant motion in which new books, new articles, and new journals appear almost weekly. And I'm sure my publisher would not forgive me for failing to mention mine. This is a short book called Break Up the Anthropocene that I published last spring, I guess, or maybe summer. It is available online for free or as an inexpensive paperback. One of the things I talk about in this book is the kind of massive, the way in which the Anthropocene is kind of growth studies for the eco-humanities, or a growth opportunity for the eco-humanities. Rival scenes have been strutting forward and puffing out their chests. What we need from this seething cauldron of alternatives, all different ways to describe the Anthropocene, is not a discourse of mastery, one scene to rule them all, but a coherent route into and through plurality. The age of Anthropos invites introspection and political outrage, and this now unavoidable term also requires careful parsing. Faced with multiple narratives and multiple overlapping discourses from the sciences to many different kinds of the humanities, all of which are trying to claim or trying to describe our unstable environmental present, readers and scholars may be forgiven for a certain befuddled or baffled attitude. What are we supposed to do with all of this Anthropocene writing? To which question I proffer of hashtag, ready for bumper stickers and coffee cups. Pluralize the Anthropocene. It's kind of long for a bumper sticker, but, academics. The pluralizing project that I'm going to describe briefly here emerges from an urgent need to re-narrate the apocalyptic story in which old man Anthropos destroys the world. To pluralize, as I describe it, represents a kind of anti-apocalypse, ideally many anti-apocalypses. We need to situate ourselves amid environmental disorder. Familiar historical responses to immensity and change, from religious awe to the romantic sublime, seem inadequate or inappropriate to the task. Rather than remodel the romantic superstructures we have inherited from the philosophical traditions of Kant and Burke and the literary forms of Milton and Shakespeare, among many others, it may be time to craft something newly dynamic out of our shared cultural history. We must admit non-human disorder into the fold, as Donna Haraway, Bruno Latour, and many others insist. But perhaps more importantly, we must also salvage amid our ruins the humane values of openness and sympathy. A plural Anthropocene seeks justice and embraces difference. The pluralizing project refuses fantasies of wholeness in favor of a dynamic and disorderly system. An agglomeration of partially overlapping and sometimes conflicting perspectives replaces the singularity of capital A Anthropos. We're left with messy assemblages overflowing with human and non-human agents and structures. This plural hodgepodge recovers from classical linguistics the gender plurality that both the Greek anthropos and the Latin homo obscure. These words mean man in a collective or species sense, but under patriarchy they have a tendency to refer only to males. Among the key values of a pluralized Anthropocene are a flexible approach to scale, a capacity for dynamic speculative range, the ability to respond to catastrophic changes, and self-reflexive creativity. These capabilities are often grouped among the special habits or talents of humanist thinking. To pluralize means to entangle or enter into. It's the opposite of revelation. The Anthropocenes that result from this process will be intimate and painful, resonating with stories from the human past and gesturing toward uncertain futures. Anthropocene entanglements invert apocalyptic unveilings. We need more beginnings and fewer endings. The name remains a problem. It's too male, too Greek, too monolithic. Contemporary theorists may argue that the Anthropocene is counterintuitively a non-anthropocentric moment. Even in Timothy Morton's somewhat breathless phrase, the Anthropocene is the first fully anti-anthropocentric concept. But even with that kind of intellectual jiu-jitsu, old man Anthropos, like old man Franzen, takes up too much space in the world, in critical theory, and on the pages of The New Yorker. Anthropos occupies the dominant and destructive positions: old, rich, male, presumptively white, brutally normative. before we can make progress with the term, we need to unweave the forces hidden in the figure. What I'm proposing then amounts to a pluralized sense of reading under Anthropocene conditions. Here I take my cue from the valuable work of eco-critics Tobias Menley and Jesse Oak Taylor in their innovative collection, Anthropocene Reading. And full disclosure, I do have a piece in this book about The Tempest. Their book gives to the stratigraphic signatures made legible by Earth system scientists the deconstructive treatment that literature scholars will remember from reading Derrida in grad school. Menley and Taylor attempt to uncover new possibilities. Quote, the species that reads itself in the stone might yet be brought into a new degree of self-awareness as a species, and out of that recognition, weave new democracies and inclusive economies conjoined to resilient ecologies. Plural reading practices help imagine plural responses to ecological dynamism. The project Menley and Taylor describe remains easier to conceive than to practice. Pluralizing can be confusing. Things we once thought we understood end up being unstable or dynamic. Stories of apocalypse feel more familiar and in a weird way are often more comforting. In plural futures, we have little to offer beside reading itself, an invariably polyglot salvage practice. We read because we are terrified, Menley and Taylor emphasize. Out of terror and interpretation, we seek not a singular solution, but a plural weave of possibilities. We seek justice and the alleviation of suffering, but not through the assimilation of all thoughts and efforts into the capacious unity of the Borg. Differences can be painful and disruptive, but plurality in thinking and living in ecosystems and politics is worth striving for. Okay, so at this point we have two problems, climate change and plural ideas of being human. So now it's time to turn to our old friend Prince Hamlet, our literary culture's patron saint of despair and alienation. And what I'm going to do with Hamlet very briefly in the second half of this talk is not in some ways, I think, what even this canonical image of Olivier in the skull might expect us to think of what Hamlet does. I'm not going to follow him down the familiar paths of melancholy or soliloquy or misogyny, and I won't celebrate his hard-won providential understanding at the end of the play of the providential meaning of the fall of a sparrow. Instead, I'm going to ask Hamlet about acting, and I'm going to focus on a moment in the middle of the play in which he shows us that acting is his favorite thing. He likes to pretend to be other people. He likes to watch other people pretend to be other people. Responding to his familial, theological, and performative crises, Hamlet thinks the only good thing is acting. Speak the speech, I pray you, as I pronounced it to you, trippingly on the tongue. Suit the action to the word to the action. Hamlet's advice speaks to the Anthropocene dilemma that Greta Thunberg and Jonathan Franzen, in their different ways, both confront. What, in the face of so much loss and uncertainty, including the loss of our own separation from the things about which we seek knowledge, can we do? Hamlet says we can only act. Hamlet insists upon making everything visible. The prince blurs the distinction between acting as false performance and acting as true action. My hope in this Anthropocene reading of Hamlet will be to show how this pre-modern theatrical fantasy can help shape responses to 21st century ecological questions. Hamlet's conception of the purpose of playing sounds more ecological than we might expect. He asked the actor to hold as 'twere the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her feature, scorn her own image, and the very age and body of the time, his form and pressure. Hamlet's terms, nature, virtue, scorn, the time, cluster around what we think of today as fundamentally ecological questions. How should humans engage with non-human nature? Ecological virtue and ecological scorn are kind of central to ecological thinking or environmental thinking, at least since the writings of John Muir, Rachel Carson, and Aldo Leopold. These scholars and writers ask us to adapt human responses to non-human models. Leopold's famous phrase is that we must act like a mountain to make sense of environmental unity. But in an Anthropocene context that erases the human-non-human boundary, the ecological purpose of playing must be to create a post-human democracy by using only the tools that Hamlet describes, voices and bodies. Hamlet's advice to the players indulges in a dramatist's and actor's fantasy that the physical can build stairs to meaning. Nor do not saw the air too much with your hand thus, but use all gently, for in the very torrent, tempest, and, as I must say, whirlwind of your passion, you must acquire and beget a temperance that may give it smoothness. The terms of the acting lesson, saw, use, acquire, beget, bespeak physicality. Hamlet's not instructing method actors who need rich psychological backstories, but skilled bodies who can physically produce actors who need the etymological link between tempest and temperance, both of which come from the Latin root tempus, which means time. Time, or the time, is the object of the acting lesson. Players create storm and time with their bodies, and these storms reconstruct external disorder as temporary forms of order. Hamlet describes the magic of acting as an etymological discovery. Speak the whirlwind clearly, and we'll see its hidden smoothness. Time is tempest, and both can be made transparent. This advice speaks a fantasy of integration. Actions will make bodies suit words, words suit bodies, and both of these moving parts will reflect time and environment. There is no hidden within, only visible actions and meanings. In ecological terms, the acting lesson replaces a desire to penetrate or disclose secrets. We might think here of Franzen's musings about the apocalypse and mortality, always asking for the thing to be revealed, with a fantasy instead of sufficient surfaces. Reimagining impenetrable outsides not as barriers but as tools suggests ways that human bodies can create meaning. But Hamlet himself, who immediately follows this passage, this surface-lauding passage, with a plea to place his friend Horatio at his heart's core, in other words, inside himself, is not satisfied with surfaces. Bodies may not be able to create all the meanings that the advice to the players promises. In Hamlet, as elsewhere, tempests feel intemperate. The ideal of smoothness cannot completely displace the play's and the hero's thirst for violence. The utopian surface movement of speech and bodies that Hamlet describes, however, is not the play's only conception of playing. The foolish old counselor Polonius introduces these same actors a little bit earlier in the play by lauding not their technique, but their plural genres. Polonius describes the troupe as the best actors in the world, either for tragedy, comedy, history, pastoral, pastoral comical, historical pastoral, scene indivisible, or poem unlimited. For the one-time university actor Polonius, the key animating force or purpose of playing emerges from genre, not technique. I've argued elsewhere that literary genre is a key concept for the environmental humanities because genres are collective forms that persist and change in time, and we need to reimagine ecological collectives. Against Hamlet's focus on solitary words and bodies, Polonius values larger intellectual and historical frame stories. The old man sounds a little ridiculous, but his conception of genre as constructed through imitation and opposition, imitatio and contaminatio, reflects both 16th century Italian genre theory and also Shakespeare's own professional practice. It's sometimes hard to sympathize with Polonius, although I must admit that the older I get, the easier I find it to sympathize with Polonius. But in reading through genre, he represents a more practical vision of collectivity than the prince's determined individualism. Creating new eco-narratives with the resources of bodies, words, and genres requires bringing together Polonius's literary formalism with the prince's attention to physical and linguistic particularity. The daunting task against which Hamlet measures himself requires finding temperance in the tempest and using the actions that a man might play to show that within which passes show. The least palpable metaphor that the play elaborates for this process is the recorder. Hamlet repeatedly asks his body to perform, but he recoils at the idea that his frenemies Rosencrantz and Guildenstern can play him as if he were an instrument. You would seem to know my stops. You would pluck out the heart of my mystery. You would sound me from my lowest note to my compass. And there is much music, excellent voice in this little organ, yet you cannot make it speak. Hamlet imagines his treacherous old friends transforming his body into a musical instrument. To record shifts the emphasis of remember into the physical realm, though notably the only bodily image in Hamlet's description of himself as the recorder is the invisible and perhaps metaphorical heart. The vocabulary of this speech is physical but abstract. Stops, mystery, note, compass, music, voice, little organ. Becoming a recorder would seem to be the apotheosis of the task Hamlet gives to the players. Here is a musical body that is precisely built to play true. But this external transformation terrifies and angers Hamlet. He refuses his own project of making his body into a meaning-making vessel. So the dilemma with which Hamlet ends these middle sections of the play, caught between too solid flesh and an inaccessible that within, resonates with our position in the post-human Anthropocene. The advent of 21st century environmental disruption has, as Timothy Clark has observed, put into crisis familiar habits of thought about humans in the world. To borrow Hamlet's language, our time is out of joint with little prospect of setting it right. In fact, Hamlet's notion that he can set time right recalls some of the more naive hopes of sustainable eco-thinking. In his antic rage after killing Polonius, Hamlet recognizes that the idea of monarchy, toward which he has at least notionally been striving, is itself empty. The king is a thing of nothing. Caught within his own skeptical insight, which recognizes his body as both food for worms and instrument of more than human music, the prince's final death-seeking resembles the eco-apocalypse that our environmental culture and writers such as Franzen both fear and seek. I would like to think that Shakespeare avoids the more facile elements of apocalyptic thinking to which Franzen falls victim, but I also think Shakespeare knows that apocalypse is a story that people love and that makes people, keep coming back night after night. The play gives us in Young Fortinbras an image of post-Hamlet futurity to Denmark. But does the foreign-born king represent something new or a return to old ways? So I don't have a utopian conclusion for the play Hamlet because it doesn't have a utopian ending. I also don't really have a fully utopian answer to these larger questions of being human in the Anthropocene. So I'm going to switch by way of conclusion to a much narrower framework and some particular ideas that I'm working on about a non-apocalyptic survival narrative for rising seas. And this is drawing a little bit on a piece I wrote for a web magazine sponsored by the Arizona State University, their new web publication called The Sundial. And it's about ocean swimming. And in fact, I'm going to use some of the same images as from Joe Croft's little film that we saw at in the break. So looking away from disaster, and maybe returning obliquely to some of the ideas about encountering disaster, I'm going to try to spin a little narrative about the human experience of enduring a threatening ecosystem through both literal and metaphorical ideas of swimming. I'm not quite sure yet how to make this practice fully supportive of Greta Thunberg's climate activism, though my focus on physical immersion has some resonance with her decision to travel to New York under sail rather than by plane. Both her practice and mine require and draw from close physical contact with the largest object on our planet, the ocean. Swimming in the ocean represents a form of immersive meditation for Anthropocene living. And I'll briefly, in conclusion, offer 4 ways that swimming represents a utopian, if still painful, future for humans living in a destabilized and dynamic environment. First, swimming as alien encounter. The best thing for me about swimming in the ocean is the salt touch of our blue planet on bare skin. The writer Philip Hoare, author most recently of Rising Tide, Falling Star, this In Search of the Soul of the Ocean, published in 2017, does a kind of daily chronicle of his pre-dawn swims. I think he lives in Southampton via social media. And it makes dazzling Twitter poetry. This is from last week, and there was a particularly good one this morning that if I could have updated the slide, I might have added to it. I posted at 4 a.m., by the way. He's up early for swimming. When I swim in the ocean, I often think about Shakespeare, and I sometimes think about Queen Margaret on the losing side of the Civil War, as she laments immersion as a kind of incomplete story, a story that can't quite end. Say you can swim, alas, 'tis but a while. I also spend time thinking about Joseph Conrad's description of swimming from Lord Jim. The way is to the destructive element submit yourself, and with the exertions of your hands and feet in the water, make the deep, deep sea keep you up. Superhero swimmers such as Michael Phelps or Lynn Cox transform Conrad's exertions into smoothness, velocity, and distance. But even these superbly trained bodies get cold and tired. The ocean caresses us and fires our imagination, but we can't go there to stay. So one of the things we do is we think about form when we swim. Another reason that a literature professor like me is drawn to swimming is that the practice is essentially generic. Swimming requires focused attention to form. I often think that teaching swimming as a teenager is sort of my formative introduction to teaching. There's nothing like trying to teach an 8-year-old how to swim to sort of provide some intensity that isn't always present in the literature classroom, particularly on like a cold morning in a deep pool. The term genre may sound overly literary in this context, and I certainly wouldn't use it when I'm teaching swimming, but the basic strokes of modern swimming, butterfly, backstroke, breaststroke, and crosstroke, are themselves highly wrought and historically developed generic forms. And if anybody got a sense to see Joe's film during the break, the postcards that are describing the strokes are incredibly great. Yeah, cigarette cards, incredibly great example of the generic nature of strokes. Interestingly, a slightly different collection of strokes than the four we now think of as the main ones. Swimming shows the practical value of attention to form in terms of survival in an alien and threatening environment. Form is what keeps you from sinking. Form moves you forward through the water. Form supports and form strengthens. The forms of swimming have emerged over time, and as we see looking at these two different examples, they change in time, as all genres do. But on some basic level, they include imitation of non-human marine animals, including dolphins and frogs, and also semi-amphibious creatures like dogs. In other words, swimming is both a form of acting and also a form of being post-human. The woodcut illustrations that I've been showing in these slides come from Everard Digby's really fantastic, amazing book, De Arte Natandi, a Latin learn-to-swim manual published in 1581 when Digby was a fellow at St. John's College, Cambridge. They show how human bodies can resemble and sometimes reimagine the postures of other creatures in order to survive in aquatic environments. Humans adapt to alien environments by processes of imitation and transformation. When we go into strange environments, we start acting in new ways. Which brings me to my almost last slide. The notion that swimming combines imitation of established forms with having one's body transformed through engagement with an alien environment returns us, as I hope you can see, to Hamlet and Polonius's ideas about acting, and also to larger questions about how we can live through a changing and destabilizing climate in the present. Swimming as acting inside dynamic and hostile environment requires a kind of actor's collaboration with a sea that is both audience and envelopment. Hamlet's lesson reminds us that acting always has a fictional vector. Applying that acting lesson to my favorite emblem of living in the Anthropocene, the solitary human swimmer in the world ocean, like this picture of me that my daughter took a couple summers ago, helps us focus on environmental vulnerability and direct engagement at the same time. I swim in the salt water of Long Island Sound every day from late May through mid-October. I sneak into other waters whenever I get the chance. As with meditation for some, swimming distracts my body and opens my mind. Sentences echo and disappear, arranging and rearranging their words as I churn along the shore, past the cormorants sunning their wings on a rock. It's not the same as gardening, which I, like Franzen, also do sometimes. It's not the same as being politically active, which I, like Greta Thunberg, do sometimes, although not to her intense extent. But for me, there's nothing like swimming to help me feel that I am acting human in this Anthropocene. Thanks.
I did say he was good. And that was amazing. The lovely links with Joe's work and all the stuff on swimming at the end. But also, how can you do that? Take something like the centre of Hamlet on acting that you think, back to front and inside out, and you've taught a million times, and just produce it in a completely new way. That was lovely. Thank you so much. And also, rather wonderfully, Steve has timed it brilliantly. So, although we haven't been doing questions today, we do have a few minutes before we round off. If anyone has a comment about the day as a whole or a question for Steve in particular, which would be nice, we do have a couple. We have time for, say, 2 comments or questions. If anyone has one.
Asking for comments is always such a dangerous thing in academics.
The ideological sort of dimensions of it, that was actually used to de-explain our crisis in Ireland during the 1980s. It was apocalyptic. There was no solution. And then all of a sudden there was a solution.
Yeah.
And then, well, it wasn't, it was a solution of sorts.
Yep.
And now we have this being recycled again with Brexit, that we're now facing apocalypse. It's just a point, really. You've got me thinking in different ways now about.
Yeah.
So thanks for that point. I really enjoyed it.
And thank you for the question. I mean, I think it's a reminder of how durable this kind of this use of apocalypse as a way of avoiding kind of compromise and engagement. That it acts as a kind of a screen which makes other narratives impossible. And it's not, I don't want to like throw out all these extraordinary works of cultural history, right? I mean, apocalypse is part of our inheritance, and we need to kind of grapple with our own attractions to it. But it has this habit of shutting out other genres and other ways of making sense of the world and making sense of our own experience of the world. And I think that that's something that's really important to sort of move against or move outside of it, outside and around, maybe.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for a really, really interesting paper. Linked to what you were just saying, I just wondered if you could kind of name check a few kind of contemporary narratives that you see responding to the kind of challenge that you're articulating, or is that something that you don't see happening?
No, I mean, I can name check some in a kind of literary sense. I mean, because they're not, because the literary sense is not for me only contemporary, right? I'm still sort of located in the early modern period imaginatively sometimes, and I think about the distinction between romance and tragedy as one of the important, historic, pan-historical maybe versions of this. So the struggle between a kind of tragic narrative which builds to an apocalyptic ending and a romance narrative, or sometimes called a tragicomic narrative, which sort of moves through tragedy into some kind of continuity or change. And I think this does happen. I mean, I think we can see this kind of desire for salvage, which is another word I used in the talk, in quite a bit of contemporary writing. I think that Franzen's actually kind of wrong about that as a narrative model, but there's both the temptation to see apocalyptic closure, and also, I mean, because the novel as a form, like if you're like me and you're a kind of obsessive reader of late classical Byzantine romance, you think that the novel as a form is actually not a thing that was invented in the 18th century, but that it has this ancient, continuous history, which is precisely a history of sort of survival and salvage, a history that is sort of dominated by shipwreck, among other things, and that is about managing to continue even under radically changed circumstances. So I hope that's helpful. It's not too many contemporary name checks, but yeah.
One final question from Helen, perhaps. We can get to-
I'm not sure it's a question yet. I've not formed it as a question, but I was just really struck by that kind of beautiful image that you ended with of you swimming and how swimming, you know, being part of the ocean, is transformative, but also humbling in a way in which I think Joe's videos really kind of show. But also that kind of focus on the body and that words are not separate from the body. And it just really struck me that today with Princess Gemma's fantastic presentation, which drew on her body as much as Watch that and was so compelling, and Jude's talking about, you know, the ways in which she's using memoir and biography and drawing on her own experience as a mother as she walks around Darwin's gardens, and that this, you know, and that this should happen today on all days when all these amazing young people around the world are turning up with their bodies, and how the kind of school strike sort of partly started with Greta Thunberg just sitting there with her body and exposing that, and how powerful it is. And so that's a comment, really, but it's all inspired by your paper.
That's a great comment, though, and I think this idea of remembering how much of that embodied scholarship is actually what we're all doing, even though we're working with words and ideas and kind of concepts and engaged often in what feel like disembodied collaborations. It's one of the reasons I actually love to be physically present with people sometimes when I'm talking about my work. I mean, I publish books and things, and I hope that people read them, but there's nothing quite like actually being physically present with other humans in a space and trying to grapple with some of these hard questions. And then the other thing I would say, and this is really my reaction to everything I heard, before, is this. I mean, it was a wonderful testament to the kind of variety that the humanities really has right now. I mean, the from kind of punk rock affect to the sense of human, like our own personal human and familial experiences that have always been part of our practice. But I think we are learning as a kind of collective body to learning ways to make that visible and to draw on it as a strength, not as a distraction or a thing that you do in your own time, but that to be responding to all the things that we do as humans is actually our job, not a distraction from our job, but actually our job.
That's a wonderful few sentences to close on. So thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Now, just before we do close, and I think there will be time to sort of hang around and talk a little more, can I introduce Professor Joe Yates, Executive Dean of Arts, Professional and Social Studies, and EDC for External Connections, or
I'm not too sure yet, Elspeth, but I'll let you know about that one.
External something.
Yes.
So congratulations
Thank you.
on that, Joe. But here's Joe just to say.
Thank you. I just want to say a few words just to round the afternoon off, really. Between Land and Sea, what a fantastic title, and it's absolutely superb to listen to the papers. And I wanted to just say I hope everyone's enjoyed an afternoon of fascinating papers and presentations, and of course the wonderful lecture by Professor Stephen Mentz. I'm a triathlete and I love to cycle, I love to swim. I've always got that sort of Flann O'Brien book about the third policeman sort of etched into the tens of thousands of miles I cycle a year. And this, in terms of acting as swimming or swimming as acting, is going to be there next time I get into the Mersey on a Saturday morning at dawn and see where that takes me. So truly, thanks for that. So the formation of the Research Institute, which is the first in the arts and humanities at LGMU, recognises research excellence of work going on in literature and creative writing. It consolidates the high reputation of excellent research in these areas, confirmed by the REF evaluation in 2014. But it also represents new beginnings and new directions. The thematic synergies that have emerged today around ideas of migration and mobility are clear. So too are their relevance to the city of Liverpool and the region, a region and a city who've been shaped by immigration and emigration, and which is indeed etched into its very cultural identity. What's also emerged today are the rich and productive differences in the various approaches you've heard about. Exploring the differences while working together is what makes for good research, transgressing disciplinary boundaries and opening up new vistas of research and scholarship. The Institute is a dynamic and vibrant research culture, and today you've glimpsed some of its work. This, however, is just the start. There are a number of events planned, some emerging out of our large collaborations in terms of working with major funders on research projects. Others will come out of individual staff research and the work of our postgraduate community, and others will emerge from our deep collaborations with the cultural organisations within our city. I hope, and indeed I know, that the Institute will provide a platform for further research innovation, which will open up new vistas in research, but will, importantly, also inspire future academics and future generations of students. I'd like to particularly thank our external speakers, Dr. Alex Thompson, who represents the broader support of the English subject area, and also Professor David Amagoni, who's spoken from his own familiarity with his work here over many years, which I think dates back to being Roger Webster's PhD student back in 1985, I believe. I'd also like to say a special thanks to you, Stephen. You've travelled a long way. You've made a long trip at a busy time of year, but you've delivered an absolutely inspirational lecture. So thanks to you too. On a final note, I'd like to importantly thank colleagues from English and creative writing whose intellectual endeavour and hard work has brought us to this point in terms of launching the Institute today. It's been their commitment to combining research excellence with a deep commitment to widening participation and transforming the lives of our students, which make research, English and creative writing at LGMU what it is today. I'd also like to just close by reflecting on the importance of the history of English and creative writing at the university. And I think this really dates back to our own history forming out of the Polytechnic and how the disciplines themselves emerged as part of the Polytechnic movement and the colleges that made it up. And I think that's what shaped the discipline here at LGMU, if I could describe it that way. The way it engages with marginalised voices and, importantly, how it transforms the lives of our students, which comes through year after year after year. So, I'm not going to go on any longer. I know that there's some wine and some sea shanties. So, just very finally, I wanted to thank a few other people. I wanted to thank Glenda for the hard work that she's put in pulling all the documentation together for the Research Centre and the Institute. And I also just wanted to say thank you to our external visitors, and I hope you've had a really sort of intellectually inspiring afternoon. I know I have in terms of the last few hours I've been here. So thank you. Okay.